Well, I think one of the reasons is it costs money. And I think a lot of these decisions end up being short-term economic decisions rather than longer-term investment decisions. And somehow consciousness on that will have to change. I wanted to mention one fact related to a question in the chat. It has to do also with preservation of forests. Last year, the wildfires in Canada, it is calculated, emitted more carbon dioxide than every nation's emissions except the top three emitters: China, India, and the United States. So that is to say those Canadian wildfires rank number 4 as a country in carbon dioxide emissions. This kind of cascading effect, these positive feedback loops, are especially dangerous, and they will have already they are already affecting ice. We haven't talked at all about ice in the webinar, but I think we ought to at least give it a minute or two. The Greenland ice cap is disintegrating. It is accelerating in its disintegration. Sea level is rising, and there are pretty strong indications that that acceleration is occurring in sea level rise, that it's not constant. The West Antarctic ice sheet, we know, is eventually going to become unstable. There's a lot of scientific consensus on that. We don't know when. There are various estimates. And then perhaps more immediate in terms of human impact is a lot of mountain glaciers around the world are shrinking, and those that provide potable water for very large populations are certainly on a shrinking trajectory. So all these things come into play as well. As John said, they're all interlinked. And unless we begin to have a stronger sense of managed connection of climate, agriculture, forest, biodiversity, and human impacts on them, we'll be in trouble. It's a huge challenge, but one that if we don't face is going to leave our grandchildren in a much altered and less comfortable condition.
So let me jump in here. There's a couple of things that you said, James, that I wanted to respond to. One was, it all comes down to cost. We've actually done some calculations on that. When I was doing work with Rainforest Trade, including Rainforest Crunch with Ben & Jerry's, I charged everybody who bought the commodities a 5% environmental premium, and they were required to pay this by contract. They couldn't buy from other people, and they had to pay that. And we guaranteed that 100% of that would go back to the communities and to generate, additional product and do basic value add to basically make the product more marketable in the supply chain. Nobody ever said that 5% raised the price. We're now doing, because it's less than half of 1% on the raw materials, which are 6 or 8% of a finished product. And so we're doing a 1% solution now. In fact, we're launching at Climate Week next week, where there'll be a 1% environmental fee being proposed on food exports from places like Brazil, but also the US. In Brazil, that'll generate about $800 million a year, every year, to address the biggest impacts of agriculture. It's not a huge amount of money, and that can be used to leverage an awful lot of other money, but it's getting the consumers to start paying for the actual cost of production. And we've hired a ag economist, David Zilberman from Berkeley, who thinks it should be 5%. He thinks 10 might be too much, but 5 would certainly be unnoticeable. And so we're just trying to get this palatable. So 1% we think is something that we can sneak through almost. But these are the kinds of systems that we need for starting to manage the planet.
I think you're right. I mean, it was 20 years ago when Sir Nicholas Stern said we should be spending 2 to 3% of our GDP every year on climate, and we haven't come close to that. But the kind of plan you mentioned, Jason, is exactly what we need.
And if we don't pay for it, what are the costs going to be? The costs are going to be countries that can't produce exports. And then what are future generations going to eat?